name is Salman Hussain. I'm the TEEB coordinator based in UNEP in Geneva, and today I want to present a case study around marine ecosystem services. It's very important to look at marine ecosystems because they provide a great deal of benefit to humanity in terms of the provision of ecosystem services overall. And further, a study by Halpern et al. Science presented the idea that not only do we have a great deal of provisioning, but that provisioning is under threat. What that means is that multiple drivers are affecting the benefits that we might generate from marine ecosystems, and often these benefits are invisible. A response to this was that the UK government tried to initiate an exercise in the development of a network of marine protected areas. Now, marine protected areas in UK parlance are called marine conservation zones, and the idea of assessing and then developing and then putting into place marine protected areas was to look at the benefits that would be lost if we were to have business as usual compared to the benefits that would actually be gained from implementing marine conservation zones. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. Whenever we're carrying out a valuation exercise, we have to be sure to understand in biophysical terms what exactly the changes we're looking at. And so the study that was commissioned by DEFRA, the UK government, wherein SAC in Edinburgh and the University of Liverpool doing the biophysical work together, that study was based on a network of marine protected areas, 3 different ones that you'll see in the slide, which had different specific conditions applied in terms of the generation of those networks. And for each of these networks, the DEFRA, the UK government, wanted to look at 2 different levels of restrictions. So again, to be clear, we want to know the counterfactual, what would happen without the marine protected areas and what would happen with the marine protected areas. The scenarios are fairly unromantically called A, G and J, which are listed in the slide that you see. And what you see in the next slide after that is the UK continental shelf. The slide of the UK continental shelf shows us the potential designation of a network of marine protected areas. But we have to go beyond that single network to look at what the benefits might be from different network options overall. Within the networks that are being assessed, there are also 2 different levels of restriction which are also to be assessed. So 3 different network scenarios and 2 different levels of restriction. As you'd imagine, the highly restricted network provision basically one where almost all actions and activities of an industrial nature would be prohibited within that marine protected area. The next slide shows where the economics cuts in. I mentioned already in scenario analysis we have to look at what happens relative to the counterfactual of business as usual. What happens if we actually apply a network of marine protected areas? What happens to provision of ecosystem services? So we have 4 rays for the sake of simplicity coming from the origin here, which show how sometimes ecosystem service provisioning will increase, sometimes it will stay stable, and sometimes it will decrease. So always looking at the change between what would happen under business as usual versus what would happen if we actually applied the marine protected area under the restrictions that are being specified. The next slide gives us a categorization of the types of services that marine ecosystems provide. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the slide after that gives us the starting point with which the consortium working on this work had to try to generate valuation benefits. Typically in valuation, we have the polar opposite problem to the one we had in this particular study. i.e. we may have a single value estimate for a single particular site, and then from that we have to somehow generalize to see what the benefits would be for a much wider area. We have the reverse here. We had a series of estimates of individual values for ecosystem services across the entire UK waters, and we somehow had to try to work out what the benefits of the marine conservation would be given these total aggregate estimates that you see in this slide. So there are 3 methodological steps we had to apply given these totals. We have a bit of a kind of what we might call a cookie cutter approach. We had to say for each of these networks, A, G and J, how much of a particular type of marine landscape or habitat is being protected. We also had to ask ourselves how important is that marine landscape in terms of provisioning of that service, and how much would the reduction therefore be in the value of ecosystem service provisioning if we were to continue under business as usual as compared to applying that protection. The next slide shows you the UK seabed landscape. After that, as I said, the slightly bizarre way of putting it, but the cookie cutter approach is to say, well, let's look at one of those types of habitats or landscapes, aphotic reef. So the next slide shows us where exactly aphotic reef, by way of example, are located within the UK seabed map. Only a subset of aphotic reef will actually be part of any one network that's going to be protected, and that is shown in the third slide. The next slides pull this all together by showing us the different landscapes under network scenario A, and equivalent maps exist for network scenario J and G. We then in the valuation team had to ask our partners who were doing the biophysical assessment to give us some indication of how we would look at particular ecosystem service and determine the importance of a particular type of marine landscape or habitat in terms of provisioning that service. So we had various responses. In terms of some services, we could look at the value based on the sheer area. Other services, the provisioning we depended upon how close it is to shoreline, for instance. So there's a range of different options we had to look at to allow for the biophysical variability in terms of landscapes and ecosystem services. So once we know how important, say for instance, aphotic reef is relative to other landscapes, the next question is how big an impact will the conservation of that particular aphotic reef have? And so the next slide looks at these different ranges that we have. Will it have a very large change? Would it be a 90% change? Or would it be a very small change overall? Economists always focus on what we call marginal change. We always have to look at the change relative to what would happen without the policy off scenario. So that marginal change might be 90%, might be 10%, but we've also got to look at the trajectory of that change, by which I mean how quickly will that change happen? And what will be the kind of change? Will it be a linear trajectory? Will it be exponential, etc.? Because ultimately we need to know when the change occurs, because in economic terms, if you're doing an impact assessment and you're applying discounting, you have to be aware of when change occurs and how it will occur. Turning to the overall results, using this valuation and applying a 3.5% discount rate, we found that the value of the benefits range between approximately 10 and 22 billion pounds. This is an extremely large number. Even in applying the sensitivity analysis, which means if we try to make a lower bound estimates for our values, that is reduced by around about 30%. What's interesting in our analysis is to look at how that actually compares with the estimates which are independently calculated and assessed in terms of costs. The present value of the cost estimates was between 0.4 and around 1 billion. So what you can see from this assessment is the ratio of benefits to costs is at least 7:1, i.e. for every pound you spend, you get a return of something like £7 in terms of benefits were you to actually apply a network of marine protected areas. Even this is an underestimate. Why? Because we are only looking at the value estimate for 7 of the 11 ecosystem services. It's extremely likely that for those other ecosystem services for which we had no valuation data point to look at, those would also be positively benefited by having marine conservation. So there's an underestimate for that reason. The second reason there's an underestimate is because there is a network effect. If we're simply assuming that 1 hectare aphotic reef, wherever it is, will generate some benefit, that is a simplification. If we constructively, in biophysical terms, generate a network of marine protected areas, the benefits from the network are greater than the individual hectares that are actually protected. It's important to understand in the valuation that we're never going to have any precision in our estimation. This is why we carry out sensitivity analysis. But it's also important to recognize that in the absence of valuation, sometimes decisions that we'd want to make that lead to conservation do not happen. The reason why this case study in particular I think is quite an important one is because this was an part of the evidence base used by the UK government to actually enact the UK Marine Act. There's extreme hesitancy and indeed a strong lobbying against conservation of marine protected areas. There are important industries such as telecommunications, fisheries, etc., who had an important voice, and that voice was recognised. But the argument made in economic terms is a very strong one, which said that the benefits are extremely large. And this is why this kind of work and implying valuation, I think, is important in terms of changing policies so we can have a more sustainable planet. Thank you very much.